16 children, 4 adults, 1 isolated house in rural Ohio. For weeks, the disturbing question surrounding the Siders family has been simple. How could 16 children allegedly live for years in conditions so severe that some could barely communicate, while almost no one outside the family seemed to know they were there? Now, a new theory is raising an even more unsettling question. Was this simply an extreme case of neglect? Or had the Siders family developed something resembling a private cult inside their own home? That possibility was recently raised by Daniela Mestianek-Young, an organizational psychologist, author, Army veteran, and survivor of the Children of God cult. Speaking about the Siders case, Young described what she believes could be a single family cult. That does not mean police have officially classified the Siders family as a cult. They have not. It does not mean prosecutors have accused them of operating a cult. They have not. And it certainly does not establish why the children were allegedly kept in the conditions investigators found. But Young's theory offers a new way of looking at one of the strangest elements of this case: the extraordinary isolation. When authorities entered the home in Hamden, Ohio on June 30th, they found 16 children ranging in age from approximately 18 months to 18 years old. Investigators described conditions inside the home as deplorable. Several children required medical treatment. 2 were initially flown to trauma centers. Authorities said many of the children had largely been confined inside a room measuring roughly 12 feet by 12 feet. Human waste was reportedly present inside the home. Some of the children had serious developmental problems. Authorities said some had difficulty speaking. One 18-year-old with developmental disabilities reportedly could not write her own name. Vinton County Sheriff Ryan Kane described the scene in unusually harsh terms. He said livestock were often kept in better conditions than what investigators found inside that house. Ohio Attorney General Andy Wilson said it was among the worst scenes he had encountered during his career. But perhaps the most disturbing part of the case was not simply what investigators found inside. It was how effectively the children appeared to have disappeared from the outside world. Neighbors told reporters they did not remember seeing the children. Authorities said the children were not enrolled in school when they were discovered. Investigators also struggled to find the normal trail of government, educational, and medical records that 16 children would usually create. The family had reportedly moved around southern Ohio over approximately 2 decades. That mobility may have made outside scrutiny more difficult. Imagine what 16 children normally leave behind in modern America: birth records, school registrations, doctor visits, vaccination records, sports teams, teachers, class photographs, friends, birthday parties, neighbors, emergency room visits, social media, parents at school events. Even a family that prefers privacy usually leaves some footprint. But according to authorities, this family appears to have existed largely outside many of those normal systems. That is where the new cult comparison becomes important. When most people hear the word cult, they imagine a charismatic religious leader standing in front of hundreds of followers. They imagine compounds, uniforms, rituals, secret teachings, or apocalyptic predictions. But experts who study coercive groups often focus less on unusual beliefs and more on power. Who controls information? Who controls contact with outsiders? Who determines what is normal? Who decides when someone can leave? Who controls education, money, relationships, and access to the outside world? And what happens when children are born into a system where the only reality they know is the one created by the adults around them? Young has described the Siders situation as potentially resembling what might be called a single-family cult. In that type of structure, there does not necessarily have to be a formal religion. There does not need to be a large organization. There may not even be a clearly stated ideology. The system can exist inside one household. The central issue becomes control. Isolation can make that control enormously powerful. If a child attends school, that child meets teachers. The child meets other children. The child learns how other families live. And the child discovers that different rules exist outside the home. Teachers may notice injuries, malnutrition, developmental delays, strange behavior, or signs of neglect. Children may also tell someone what is happening. School creates comparison. Comparison creates questions. And questions can threaten an abusive closed system. Medical care creates another point of outside contact. A doctor sees the child. A nurse asks questions. Records are created. Developmental problems become documented. Malnutrition becomes visible. Injuries may require explanation. When children are separated from institutions like schools and medical systems, those layers of protection can disappear. That does not prove why the Siders' children allegedly had so little outside contact, but it helps explain why isolation is such an important part of this investigation. There is another detail that makes the family dynamic even more complicated. Elizabeth Siders is now 33 years old. According to reporting about the case, she married Gary Siders when she was approximately 15. Her attorney has now suggested publicly that Elizabeth herself may need to be understood not only as a defendant, but potentially as someone who spent much of her life inside an abnormal family environment. That creates an extremely difficult question. Can someone be both a possible victim of a controlling system and eventually become an adult accused of perpetuating that same system? Psychologists who study abusive families have examined versions of that question for decades. Children do not automatically abandon the world they grew up in when they become adults. Sometimes they repeat it. Sometimes they normalize it. Sometimes they defend it. And sometimes behavior that seems obviously horrifying to an outsider may have become ordinary inside a closed environment. None of that removes legal responsibility, and none of it proves that this is what happened in the Siders family. But it may help explain why investigators and attorneys are now looking closely at the mental state of several adults connected to the case. Gary Siders Jr. has requested a competency evaluation. Elizabeth's attorney has also asked that she be formally evaluated to determine whether she is competent to stand trial. Her attorney has gone further. If she is found competent, he has requested another evaluation concerning her mental condition at the time of the alleged offenses. In other words, the defense may explore whether Elizabeth suffered from a mental condition serious enough to affect her criminal responsibility. Competency to stand trial and legal insanity are not the same thing. Competency asks whether a defendant can currently understand the proceedings and assist in his or her defense. An insanity defense concerns the defendant's mental condition when the alleged crime occurred. Those are separate legal questions, and an evaluation does not mean that a defendant will ultimately be declared incompetent or legally insane. But the fact that these questions are being raised adds another layer to an already unusual family structure. What did the adults inside this house believe was normal? How did they understand the conditions around them? Were all four adults operating with the same understanding? Was one person more influential than the others? Was there a hierarchy? Was there fear? Dependence? Manipulation? Or was this simply a group of adults independently failing 16 children? At this stage, we do not know, and that distinction matters. There is a danger in using the word cult too easily. It is a dramatic word. It attracts attention. But a dramatic label should never replace evidence. There has been no public allegation that the Siders family followed a secret religion. There has been no announcement of a cult doctrine. No manifesto has been revealed. Authorities have not described a formal cult organization. What exists right now is a psychological interpretation based on patterns of isolation and control that an expert believes may resemble dynamics seen in cult environments. Young's perspective is unusual because this subject is not merely academic for her. She grew up inside the Children of God, a notorious religious group later known as the Family International. She has described growing up in an environment where children were controlled by adults, where outside information was limited, and where abusive behavior could become normalized inside the group. She eventually escaped as a teenager. She later served as a United States Army intelligence officer and studied organizational psychology. Her work now focuses heavily on systems of control. When Young looks at an isolated household like the Siders family, she is therefore examining something specific. Not whether the family wore matching clothing, not whether they worshipped an unusual leader, not whether they held bizarre religious services. She is looking at whether the family may have created a closed reality. That concept may help explain why cases like this are so difficult for outsiders to understand. People often ask why someone did not simply leave, but leaving requires knowing that another reality is available. Imagine being born inside a house where 16 children live under the same rules. Imagine rarely seeing classmates because you do not attend school. Imagine having little contact with doctors or other trusted adults. Imagine that the people who define right and wrong are the same people controlling your food, shelter, education, transportation, and access to the outside world. For a young child, that environment is not strange. It is simply life. The child has no independent baseline. And when many siblings share the same experience, the environment may feel even more normal. Everyone around you is living the same way. There is no obvious comparison. That is one reason social isolation can be so powerful. The outside world becomes distant. The family becomes the entire social universe. Authorities have said the Siders family had lived at the Hamden property for roughly 4 years. Yet people nearby said they did not know 16 children were living there. That fact remains astonishing. 16 children are not easy to hide. They make noise. They grow. They need clothes and food. They normally leave the house. They normally interact with other people. And yet, neighbors describe seeing little or nothing of them. The house itself was not hidden hundreds of miles from civilization. It was in a small Ohio community. People drove past it. Trains passed nearby. Stores were not impossibly far away. The family existed geographically inside society, while apparently remaining socially separated from much of it. That difference is crucial. Isolation does not always require a remote compound. Sometimes isolation exists because the people inside a home simply do not participate in the system surrounding them. And that raises another major question. How did authorities finally find the children? Not because a teacher reported suspicious injuries. Not because a doctor sounded an alarm. Not because a neighbor saw 16 neglected children and called police. According to authorities, investigators entered the property while pursuing an unrelated investigation. Only then was the larger situation discovered. That means the system designed to protect children may never have seen them clearly enough to intervene earlier. This case therefore extends far beyond one family. It raises questions about how children can disappear from normal institutional oversight. What happens when a family repeatedly moves? What happens when children are not attending school? What happens when medical records barely exist? Which agency is supposed to notice? And at what point does extreme privacy become dangerous isolation? Those questions will remain long after the criminal case is resolved. There is also a risk of oversimplifying the adults. It may eventually be proven that different adults had very different levels of responsibility. One may have exercised greater control. Another may have known more. Another may have participated differently. Another may argue that he or she was also manipulated. Those facts will have to be tested through evidence. Prosecutors currently accuse the 4 adults of serious child endangerment. The defendants have entered not guilty pleas. The allegations have not yet been proven at trial. That legal presumption matters even in a case where the conditions described by investigators are deeply disturbing. But regardless of what happens in court, the children remain at the center of this story. They have been removed from the home and placed under the care of child welfare authorities. For some, rescue from the house may only be the beginning. Children raised under severe isolation can face enormous challenges when suddenly entering the outside world. Language, education, social skills, trust, medical treatment, daily routines, basic independence. Things most children learn gradually may have to be learned much later. And for older children, there is another challenge. They may have to reconsider everything they believed was normal. The walls of an isolated system can disappear physically in a single day. Psychologically, they may take years to come down. This is why the latest theory about the Siders family deserves attention, but also caution. Calling something a cult does not explain everything. It should not become an excuse, and it should not become a shortcut around evidence. But the concept of a closed family system may help investigators, psychologists, and the public ask better questions. How was authority distributed inside the household? How much freedom did individual family members actually have? Why were the children apparently separated from school and medical care? How did the adults explain their lifestyle to themselves? Were the children taught to fear outsiders? Were they prevented from leaving? Were older siblings expected to enforce rules on younger ones? Did the family deliberately move to avoid detection? Or did a combination of poverty, mental illness, instability, neglect, and isolation gradually create the conditions investigators eventually discovered? Those answers may emerge through court records, psychological evaluations, interviews, and future testimony. And one answer may be especially important. What did Elizabeth Siders understand about her own situation? She reportedly entered this relationship while still a teenager. Years later, she became the mother of a very large family. Now she stands accused alongside her husband and his parents. If her attorney's argument develops further, the court may eventually have to examine whether Elizabeth was simply one of the adults responsible for the alleged neglect, or whether she also spent years under some form of psychological control. Those possibilities are not mutually exclusive. A person can suffer harm and later cause harm. A victim can become part of the system that once controlled them. Understanding that process does not excuse what happens to the next generation. It may, however, explain how destructive family patterns survive. And that may ultimately be the biggest mystery inside the Ohio House of Horrors. Not simply how 16 children lived in terrible conditions, but how an entire family could apparently create a reality in which those conditions continued year after year. A reality so isolated that neighbors barely knew the children existed. A reality with so little outside oversight that normal warning systems apparently failed. And perhaps a reality so powerful that some of the adults themselves may now require psychological evaluation to determine whether they fully understand the legal proceedings against them. Was this family truly functioning like a small cult? That has not been proven. For now, it remains one expert's interpretation of the disturbing patterns emerging from the case. But the theory forces us to ask a question that may prove more important than the label itself. When a family cuts itself off from schools, doctors, neighbors, and outside institutions, who is left to tell the children that what is happening to them is not normal? And if no one enters that closed world for years, how long can that world continue before someone finally discovers what is happening behind the door?